Thank you. Thank you so much, Eden. And I do recall our very first meeting, as you said, in 2010, and also our subsequent meeting in 2011 in your lovely city, in Constanța, in Romania. And I was very struck when we were standing on the shores of the sea, how you spoke about water and said water has so many shapes and forms and behaviors. And I think today that's an attribute we think of in very malign terms in the context of the virus with which we are dealing. Its forms, its shapes, its behaviors, and the impact those behaviors will have on our own behavior and our own lives. And I'm immensely privileged to follow two leading and distinguished figures, President Constantinescu and his wonderful metaphor of the arbitration of knowledge and power. I think something that he himself personifies as a scholar in his own right, who has studied 4 billion years of our planet's history as a geologist, and the power that he exercised as president of Romania. And the fact that he's been able to bring that arbitration and also ensure, again in his phrase, that no mediocrity enters into the equation. And to speak immediately after someone whom I have, and I say this with a certain Hindu precision, someone whom I've revered for a number of years, Professor Jeff Sachs, is an honor in its own right. I think Jeff has, to my mind, the distinction virtually unique to any scholar that he speaks not only of problems, but of solutions. He founded, with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Everything he's written has posed a challenge, but has also offered a solution. And that, in a sense, leads me to what I would like to share with you today. I also wanted to recall that exactly a year ago today, on May the 14th, 2019, I was fortunate to be in the capital of your lovely country, Eden, in Bucharest at a conference. And I was sitting at dinner with a very distinguished scientist, and he turned to me and said, "You know, today is May the 14th. I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you know that it is a very important day in United Nations history?" And I was a little taken aback because, having worked for 25 years at the United Nations, I thought I knew all the milestones. And I said, "That escapes me. What exactly is it important for?" And he said it was on this day, May the 14th, in 1796, that a British pharmacist, Edward Jenner, administered the first vaccine for smallpox. So from that date, in 1796, to May the 14th, 2020, a space of 224 years, if my mathematics is right, we have moved from the first prevention of smallpox to its global eradication 40 years ago. And that's both salutary, but in a sense, it's also a warning. Will we need 200 years or 2 centuries to be able to conquer the virus with which we are now faced? At the time, as we speak, there is so much of intellectual energy being put into the development of vaccine. And when people think and estimate what that vaccine would imply, if every individual on the planet were to receive that vaccine, it would cost us $20 billion. What is $20 billion in gross national or international product terms? It is 2 hours of global output. So the choice seems so obvious and so clear, and yet so elusive. And so from that perspective, I wanted to briefly suggest to you 4 areas in which we must factor the world as it will look after the present pandemic. The first, definitely, is the global. We've had, in the course of human history, episodes of conflict which have cost millions of lives. And each of them have ended in a treaty, in a coming together of adversaries and the victors in a new definition of a global order. We had the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1703, the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, and of course, a century earlier in 1815, the Congress of Vienna. And then in 1945, we had the Charter of the United Nations, 75 years ago, drawn up in San Francisco. And so the question is, are we now prepared for a new global summoning of both political and intellectual energies to be able to deal with the world after the coronavirus? A world in which we recognize the sovereignty of nations, the interdependence of nations, but also the dependence of nations upon the knowledge which so many in this virtual room that we are in today personify. The second element, of course, is the national. We've had a very curious phenomenon over the last several years where entirely democratic processes result in the election of leaders who do not necessarily believe in and who want to inhibit democracy. Is that going to be the model for the 21st century that we are now in? Or will there be, to go back to the president's arbitration of knowledge and power, an arbitration between wisdom and power, between foresight and power? The third element, I think, which we will have to confront, and happily so, is the diminution of stereotypes. Until now, and Professor Sachs has documented this very vividly, the idea of disease or pandemic were really seen as something which began in the less affluent world. Today, if you look at the number of coronavirus fatalities in the world, more than 90% are in the developed world. And if you include countries like China and Brazil and Iran, that comes up to 96%. So it's no longer that very curious phrase that has been employed so often, the question of tropical diseases, as if to say that the temperate zones are completely illness-proof, disease-proof, and have been vaccinated or insulated against illnesses in the far south. Equally, it is a challenge of stereotypes in the context of what I want to come to next, but which is pertinent in our discussion today, of education. Because the people whom we today need the most are people whom we refer to often as unskilled workers, the healthcare agents, the people who bring us our daily supplies, that vital, often called informal sector. Will we be able to challenge and to destroy that stereotype? And that finally brings me to the question of education after the pandemic. Now, education, we have always thought, and I think that in this room we can say, is an acquisition of knowledge. Will we need to think of education also as a means of jettisoning and diminishing the array of knowledge we have? I know that we have Professor Karin Marklidis with us today. And in her homeland, Sweden, there is, to my mind, a wonderful practice. It's called döstädning, which is death cleansing, where a family gets together and says, look, we, husband and wife, are going to die in 30 years' time. We do not want to leave all our accumulated possessions, the happy clutter of our lives, to our children to deal with. So let's begin getting rid of it now. Is there a process in education which can lead to that, which can convince us as global citizens that we must begin to jettison things which are impairing our lives, and to go back to the words of the United Nations Charter, which are impairing the lives of succeeding generations, whether it is behavior, whether it is waste, whether it is neglect, whether it is short-sightedness, all the negative attributes that we have allowed to clutter our souls? Are we prepared to use education as a means to get rid of it? In a sense, if I can borrow a metaphor from Professor Luciano Sasso, whom we'll hear from later this morning or this afternoon, it's a question of the antioxidants that education provides, dealing with the free radicals, which a lack of education and a lack of foresight allow to swirl around us. It's what my good friend David Pagan once described as the islands of the mind, where in the mind you think of these various concepts in isolation, unrelated to each other, without realizing not only their connection, but the infinite way that they will destroy each other. It also brings in what Dr. Pericles Mitskas spoke about, the triple helix between education, government, and business. The idea of a new norm of intellectual property, where we realize, as the negotiators at Doha did in 2011, that there must be trade-related intellectual property rights, where if there is a public health emergency, patents are subordinate. Can that be a factor of education? So these are the thoughts that I would like to leave with you, and I'm looking forward to learning much more about this in the course of our conversation. And as someone from the United Nations, which is now in a sense celebrating or observing its 75th anniversary, I wanted to leave you with a thought by the Nobel laureate from Romania, the Nobel laureate in literature, Herta Müller, who said in her acceptance speech in Stockholm that when she was a little girl, every day when she left for school, her mother used to come to the door saying, "Herta, have you remembered to take your handkerchief?" And this was a code between them. It was almost an idea that she would not allow her daughter to leave without it, and the daughter would not leave without that reassurance of her mother's affection. So over time, Herta began to leave her handkerchief at home so that she could come back to pick it up. Today, I think for all 8 billion of us on the planet, this is a situation where we say, we, as the United Nations, is that going to be the handkerchief in our lives? Will we allow a chance for that to get together and come and allow us to go into the world equipped by that sense of internationalism? Sometimes in these dark days, you are cheered by those little icons or motives that you get, especially in WhatsApp or messages. And I received a lovely one just this morning, which said, when you replace the I with the we, illness becomes wellness. And that is the thought that I would like to leave you with. Today, when I try to log into this program, as I mentioned, I'm one of those last surviving technologically illiterate Indians. I didn't know what to do because I had the sign saying, enter the conference room now. So I sent Eden a frantic message saying, how do I enter the conference room? And Eden sent back a terse message saying, push the button. And I pushed the button, and here I am. That is the choice between us today. We have to push the button. The question is, there's not just one button before us. There is a choice of buttons. But if we choose wisely, if we choose well, then we can restore this planet to what we, the citizens of the 21st century, deserve it to be. Thank you.